Today we're going to be rendering the back end of this house. Now the original plan was going to hack the render off. We're going to start afresh because there's quite a few cracks around the areas, there's quite a bit of damaged areas, so when I was quoting it from below, it's going to hack it back to brickwork and start again. Now when we've started, what we've come across is this. This is basically precast concrete. So when we start hacking back, there's no brick, we've just got lots of stones, lots of precast. So basically this was shuttered in and then poured on top, which basically means if we were to hack the render off, it's going to do more damage than good. So the plan is today, and the video, is to find out the way of how we're going to render this, how we're going to get over this problem, and how we're going to make sure that we can get a nice finish on top of this existing rendered wall. So the first thing we're going to do is get the paint off. So the first thing we're looking to do is get that paint off the wall. We want to make sure that it's got the best key it possibly can. So I'm just making sure I cover all my bases before I start any rendering. Basically I've just got to scabble a bit on top of a grinder, and this is a great way just to get all that old paint off. And I'm going to literally make sure I've stripped back to that base coat. From there we're going to try and decide the best way to move forward. We've got lots of cracks, lots of bad areas, but here's what we've got to do next. Now we've took the paint off, we've got to do something to make sure that anything after this point is going to be safe. And what we've got to do is a test patch. This is where we put a sample of render on the wall with mesh embedded in it. And what we're going to essentially do is leave it to dry. You advise it's basically a day per millimetre. So you want it fully cured. But then what we want to do is pull the mesh from the render. And then if the render behind the mesh stays on the wall, then we're good to go. We can move on with the process. Okay, so let's get this test patch going. I'm going to talk about what render I'm using in a bit. I just want to make sure that we can move forward in the process. But all we're going to do is apply a square metre of render. Again, I'll talk about the render closer in this video. And what we're going to do is create a nice notched grip through it. So this is a serrated straight edge. So I'm going to create a 10mm grip through, and this is mesh. This is just render mesh that we're going to place on top. And what we want to do is keep that castellation, so where the notches are, we don't really want to push that mesh right back into it again. This is a glimpse in how we're going to deal with this wall, by the way, but what we do is just gently bed it on top, so we've still got that notch underneath, so that mesh is quite close to the forefront of the render. And then we're going to put a fresh layer of render on top of that. The idea being that when we pull the mesh back, we want that original base coat of render to stick to that wall. What I'm doing here at the same time is I'm just going to fill them cracks. So all them cracks that have gauged out, I've notched them out and really grinded them out with that scabbler bit. So what I'm going to do is put a first base coat. I'm going to put a tight coat of mesh running through that cracked area, and I'm going to really bed it in and make sure that it's all nice and tight. And I'm also potentially going to put another layer of mesh over all of this, but I just want to make sure that them cracks aren't going to come back. So like I said, I've grinded them deep, right back to the core, and there's some areas that they had to actually hack off and bring back, but I want to make sure that we haven't got any troubled areas. So what I'm doing is essentially doubling up on the protection, and now all them cracks have been filled. I've got tight mesh running pretty much all the way through the build, to be honest. Everywhere you can see render, there's mesh on top. So, we've made sure that we've covered our bases here. And now we're ready for the full process. Right, so we're back at the job. This is the moment of truth. We're now going to see if the test patch has been successful. This is pretty much the most poignant part of this job, the job of fuck up so far. If we peel the mesh back and the render underneath sticks to the wall, then we're okay. Now if we steal the mesh back and it all comes off, then we know we've got to come out with a new plan. So let's try and pray that this is going to work. Let's have a look. So what we're looking for here is looking for that base coat to stay. Now this was a bit nerve-wracking, to be honest, but you can really see that mesh doesn't want to come off. It's hard to pull off, and basically that base coat looks like it's nice and solid to the wall. So this was a major success, which means we can now move forward with the process and get this wall rendered. That's it. So all we've got to do now is get rid of that area, back to the scabbler. Going to grind it right back. Seems like a pointless task, but we know we're covered now. We know we can safely work on this wall. And this is the render we're going to be using. It's called Star Contact. It's a Biomit product, and it's basically a base coat and an adhesive that they also use for the insulated render boards. So it's a good universal product. It's breathable also if you are working any older properties. And all we're going to do is the same thing that I was showing you on the patch, but all the way through now. And we're just going to apply that star contact directly to the wall, getting a nice tight coat on. We want to be looking to apply about, let's say 5 mil, something like that. We want to basically just come behind the bead. So when we applied that render bead, the meshed bead, we kind of pushed it forward a little bit. And we're going to render up to that bead, and again, using the notched straight edge, which is from Rafina. They sent me that, by the way, so thanks Rafina. It's a solid straight edge. I'm going to put all them notches through, and then we're going to do the same thing what we did before and bed the mesh on top. And it's called keeping encapsulation, which is basically where we just gently apply the mesh on top. So I'm going to go through that in a second with you. As you can see, you can keep the roll on the floor, pull it up to your top position, and we want to really put that mesh right up tight to these mesh beads, and we make sure we got a full layers of protection running through. We also applied stress patches on the corners of the windows, which is where we cut strips, and we applied them on the edges to make sure that if there is any movement around the windows, then we are fully protected. So there's also stress patches underneath to make sure that we are fully protected on the corners also. So as you've seen there, the mesh was just sat on top of the castellation, sat on top of the notched render, which means the mesh is at the forefront of the patch. What you do then is you wait for that to dry, or you can do green on green. I actually applied it the same day, so I applied the render on top of the mesh on the same day, and what we've done is just apply another tight coat on top to make sure that we are now keeping that mesh covered. So you don't want this layer of render to be too thick. What I've done now is I'm working from the beads and I'm rendering to the beads. So what we want that finished render to finish in line with the corner beads we put on. So what I always do is I always rule my render. Whatever type of render it is, I'm always going to rule it flat. So applied the star contact, put a nice tight coat on top of that mesh. We're going to try and rule it as flat as we possibly can. One bit of advice when using this product, I wouldn't wait too long before you start to rule it, because it does skin over quite fast. So I'd get on it as fairly fast as you can. So I'm working in short, small areas, ruling it as I go. And that way we're just going to get a real nice finish on it. But like I said, you want it to be tight. You don't want this to be too thick. We're going to keep the render tight to the beads, and we're going to, at the end of it, have a nice flat wall. So always rule it. Now, I tend to like to float on the same day, but it's winter, it's cold, and it's not dried as fast as I would have liked. So I had to come back the next morning, doused a bit of water on the render and float it up. But again, I always like to float the star contact. It is going to have a top coat, so it is going to be finished with something else, which I'll show you in the later part of this video. But I still like to float my work and make sure that it's dead flat, because when you rule it, it does have a tendency to drag on the beads, which can leave a bit of a ripple effect running through. So I like to float it. If you're struggling to float it, you can add a bit of water. It'll bring itself back, and it's actually really nice to float once you get the hang of it. Look, you can really see that it comes through. You get that creamy mix back on the go, and you start to get your walls dead flat when you float it. So, you know, some people don't like to float. Some people don't like to rule it, but for me, I want to make sure that that base coat is absolutely bang on. We've got a rule running through, the wall's flat, dead flat from bead to bead. So we know when that top coat's on, we've got a lovely base to work to. But before we do the top coat, we need to prime it. So this, look how solid that is. It's an absolute mint product. You don't think much from it, but when it dries, it is absolutely solid, and it's very flexible as well. So it's going to give to the movement of the building. It's actually designed to be put on insulation boards, so you can imagine how flexible this product is. We're priming this now with Uni Primer. That's what it is, I just applied. So you want to wait a day per millimetre for that base coat before you apply the primer, and make sure it's fully dry. Again, the primer we use is Uni Primer, and this is the top coat. It's called Silicon Top. It's a silicon render, and you can have any colour you want. They've chose obviously a blue colour, and what we want to do is apply a very tight coat of this render on top of that primed wall, and then this is a finish. So I like to add water to my product, so it all comes pre-mixed, but I like to add about 150 to 200 millilitres of water to the bucket, give it a good mix up, and that way it's just easier to apply. If it's too thick, I find that a lot of it just falls on the floor, so let's give it a bit of water, makes it a bit more viscous and a bit easy to work with. But again, don't add any more than 250 millilitres of water, and make sure that you're happy with it at the beginning. So maybe just start slowly if you're new to this, add a little bit of water at a time and test, because everyone uses the products differently, don't they, in plastering, rendering, everyone is different. So give it a go first before you try it. But what I'm going to do is apply a tight layer of render running through. Now you don't want to get too far ahead of yourself with silicone render, it does set. Now it is the winter when I did this job. Why I'm rendering in the winter is beyond me, I don't really know. But yeah, don't go too far ahead of yourself, especially in the summer. Maybe just do a meter length across every time, because it can dry quite fast. So what we're going to do is apply it. There is a finishing process which I'll show you in a minute, but what we want to do is apply a tight coat, and then what I like to do is come back on myself and give it another trowel. What we're doing here is nice open trowel, nice wide angle, and what we're going to do is scrape that plaster back even further to make sure it's as tight as possible. You don't want a thick coat of silicone top when you're floating up. You'll just drag and it feels like it's pulling. The tighter you can get that render, the better your finish is going to be. So when you're done, put your float close to the wall. We're going to work in small circular motions, and what we're doing is just binding the aggregate together, the aggregate in the top coat, and it gives you a nice, consistent, universal finish. In terms of reveals, we want to float to the outer edges where the reveals are, and then run your float up and down the bead. That's how you're going to get your real nice, clean, sharp corners. So first thing you do is you float towards the bead, and you want to get all that aggregate stuck to the outside, and then any excess that you will get once you've floated to the outer edge, you want to make sure that you float upwards along the bead, and that way you're going to get that nice clean angle like we said before. So just to reiterate, we float to the outer edges of the bead, make sure all the aggregate's there, and then float up and down it to make sure that you get a nice tight finish. I always like to have a bit of polystyrene underneath to protect myself from anything falling below the scaffold, and the sills were cleaned afterwards. Now the owner ended up painting them and making good, because once this finishes, you'll see at the end of the video, they did look as nice as it could have been. So they needed a bit of TLC, but I still like to clean as I go. So as I'm floating up, I've also got the wet wipes out, cleaning the windows, cleaning around the areas, and it just makes for an easier, nicer job towards the end. And that's it. Considering it was a nightmare to begin with, we are left with a nice finish. Nice tight finish, which is safe, it's been tested, and we know that this is going to work and last for a foreseeable future.